On a humid morning in the third week of July 1942, somewhere in the vast expanse of the South Pacific Ocean, American military engineers were accomplishing something that defied everything Japanese military planners believed possible about warfare and construction. The island was called Espiritu Santo, a remote piece of land that had been covered in dense tropical vegetation just 3 weeks prior. Now, as the sun rose on that 20th day of July, American bulldozers were completing the final grading work on an airstrip that stretched 6,000 feet across terrain that had recently been impenetrable jungle. The unit responsible for this remarkable achievement was relatively small by conventional military standards, just 387 men from the 3rd Construction Battalion Detachment of the United States Navy, supported by a modest collection of heavy equipment that included 6 tractors and 2 scrapers. What made this accomplishment so significant wasn't merely the speed of construction, though that was impressive enough, but rather what it represented in terms of industrial capability and organizational efficiency compared to what Japanese military doctrine considered achievable. Japanese military planners, working from pre-war assessments that would later be captured and translated by Allied intelligence services, had calculated that American forces would need a full year or possibly longer to establish offensive operations after securing any territory in the Pacific theater. This assumption was based on their own experience with military construction projects, which typically required thousands of laborers working for months to complete major infrastructure like airfields. The Japanese military establishment had no frame of reference for understanding mechanized construction at the scale and speed that American forces could achieve. While no Japanese observer left behind a diary entry specifically documenting this particular airfield construction on Espiritu Santo, intelligence documents captured later in the war and interrogations conducted after Japan's surrender revealed that Japanese military strategists had fundamentally miscalculated American industrial and engineering capabilities. These miscalculations would prove catastrophic as the war progressed, forcing Japanese commanders to repeatedly revise their understanding of what their opponent could accomplish in terms of base construction and logistics support. The documentary evidence for understanding how Japanese forces encountered and reacted to American construction capabilities comes from a variety of sources rather than from any single comprehensive account. Most Japanese military records were systematically destroyed as the war turned against them, either deliberately to prevent capture or simply lost in the chaos of defeat. Personal diaries and memoirs, which might have provided intimate perspectives on how individual soldiers and officers processed the shock of witnessing American construction capabilities, are scarce. What survives instead is a mosaic of evidence including detailed American construction records that document exactly what was built and how quickly, Japanese strategic decisions that reveal their evolving awareness of American capabilities, translated intelligence documents that show Japanese pre-war assumptions, post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese officers and construction personnel, and the few memoirs written by Japanese officers who survived the war. This story therefore emerges not through eloquent personal testimony, but through the convergence of facts, statistics, strategic decisions, and their undeniable impacts on how the war unfolded. It becomes a narrative about how Japanese military leadership came to understand, perhaps too late, that they faced an adversary whose industrial capacity exceeded their own by orders of magnitude they had never considered possible. The first major encounter between Japanese forces and American construction capabilities at operational scale occurred during the Guadalcanal campaign, though the full significance of what they were witnessing would not immediately register with Japanese commanders. When United States Marines stormed ashore on the 7th of August in 1942, they achieved tactical surprise and quickly captured a Japanese airfield at a location called Lunga Point that was nearing completion. The Japanese had committed substantial resources to constructing this airfield, employing a workforce of 2,774 laborers that included 1,379 Japanese workers, 1,145 Korean conscript laborers, and 250 civilians recruited from the local population. These workers had been laboring for more than a month using predominantly manual methods to clear jungle, grade terrain, and prepare a runway surface. The American Marines who captured the facility found it sufficiently advanced that they could make use of it with relatively modest additional work. Within 6 days of the initial landing, American forces had transformed the captured Japanese construction project into an operational airfield that could support combat aircraft. This facility, which the Americans renamed Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway, would become one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate in the entire Pacific War. The 1st Naval Construction Battalion unit to arrive and work on Henderson Field was the 6th Naval Construction Battalion, which came ashore on the 1st day of September in 1942. This unit comprised 387 enlisted men and 5 commissioned officers, a modest force that would accomplish work far beyond what their numbers might suggest. These men, who would become known by the nickname Seabees, derived from the phonetic pronunciation of the initials CB for Construction Battalion, immediately began expanding and improving the airfield, even as combat operations continued around them and Japanese forces launched daily attacks attempting to recapture the facility. The pattern that established itself at Henderson Field would repeat across the Pacific Theatre in subsequent campaigns. Japanese forces, operating from their major base at Rabaul, several hundred miles to the northwest, launched regular bombing raids against the airfield. Every day at approximately noon, formations of Mitsubishi G-4M medium bombers, which Allied forces called Betty bombers, would appear overhead and attempt to crater the runway and destroy parked aircraft. The Seabees worked continuously to repair damage, often filling bomb craters and restoring the runway surface while under fire or between attacks. The most dramatic demonstration of American construction resilience at Henderson Field occurred during the night of October 13th to 14th in 1942, when Japanese naval forces mounted a massive bombardment of the airfield. 2 Japanese battleships, the Kongo and the Haruna, closed to relatively short range under cover of darkness and proceeded to fire their main batteries at the airfield for an extended period. These were formidable warships mounting 14-inch guns, and they fired over 900 rounds of heavy shells at Henderson Field, creating massive craters and destruction across the facility. The bombardment represented one of the most concentrated naval gunfire attacks against a land target in the Pacific War up to that point. 53 separate craters pockmarked the runway surface, and much of the airfield's infrastructure sustained damage. Japanese commanders conducting this bombardment assumed they had effectively put Henderson Field out of operation for weeks, if not months, given the scale of destruction their battleships had inflicted. Yet by dawn on October 15th, less than 12 hours after the bombardment ceased, American construction personnel had restored the runway to operational status. Aircraft were taking off and landing again, ready to contest Japanese air superiority and interdict Japanese supply efforts. This rapid restoration of capability after such massive damage forced Japanese military planners to fundamentally reassess their understanding of American construction and repair capabilities. The Japanese military response to Henderson Field's continued operation reveals their growing awareness of how significant American construction capabilities were to the campaign's outcome. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet and Japan's most prestigious naval officer, personally redirected his force's primary mission from supporting ground operations to destroying Henderson Field. The famous Tokyo Express runs, in which Japanese destroyers made high-speed night runs down a passage that American forces nicknamed the Slot to deliver supplies and reinforcements to Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, were partly a response to Henderson Field's threat to slower and more vulnerable transport vessels. Japanese logistics planning had to adapt to the reality that as long as Henderson Field remained operational, slower cargo ships attempting to resupply Japanese forces on Guadalcanal during daylight hours would face devastating air attacks. This fundamental alteration of Japanese logistics, forced by the presence of a single rapidly constructed and continuously maintained American airfield, contributed directly to the inadequate supply of Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal. Japanese soldiers on the island would eventually begin starving as the logistical situation deteriorated, and this supply crisis played a major role in their ultimate defeat. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded the first major Japanese ground counterattack aimed at recapturing Henderson Field from American forces. Ichiki led a force of 917 men, a detachment from a larger unit that had been selected for rapid deployment to Guadalcanal. He possessed confidence that his force could successfully assault and retake the airfield, based on Japanese military doctrine's emphasis on offensive spirit and the element of surprise. His force was effectively annihilated at the Battle of the Tenaru River on August 21st in 1942, with most of his men killed in the attack and Ichiki himself dying in the battle. His personal papers and journals, if they ever existed, were destroyed with him. However, captured operational orders from his unit that fell into American hands reveal no indication that Japanese planning appreciated the scale of American construction capability or the extent to which Henderson Field had been developed since its capture. Japanese intelligence had led Ichiki to expect he would be attacking a partially completed airfield held by a relatively modest garrison. Instead, he encountered a fully operational airbase already hosting 31 Marine Corps aircraft, with substantial defensive preparations protecting it. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake commanded the Japanese 17th Army, which had operational responsibility for recapturing Guadalcanal. Under his command, Japanese forces mounted 3 major ground offensives between August and November of 1942, all aimed ultimately at retaking Henderson Field. Each of these assaults was planned based on assumptions about American construction and repair capabilities that would prove dramatically incorrect. Following the massive naval bombardment by the battleships Kongo and Haruna on the night of October 13th to 14th, Hyakutake's staff officers calculated that Henderson Field would be inoperative for at least several weeks given the scale of destruction they believed had been inflicted. This assessment drove the timing of a major ground assault planned to coincide with the airfield's presumed incapacitation. When the airfield instead proved operational within hours, forcing a complete revision of their operational timeline and assumptions, it required Japanese planning staffs to fundamentally reassess what American forces were capable of accomplishing in terms of damage repair and facility maintenance. This recognition that American construction and engineering capabilities far exceeded Japanese expectations rippled through Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the war. As American offensive operations pushed westward into the Central Pacific during 1943, the disparity between American and Japanese construction capabilities became increasingly stark to those Japanese defenders who survived long enough to witness it. The campaign for the Gilbert Islands provided perhaps the single most shocking demonstration of pure construction speed that Japanese forces would witness. At Tarawa Atoll, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history occurred in November 1943. After securing the island through intense combat that cost thousands of American casualties, construction personnel immediately began work on the captured Japanese airfield. The battle-damaged runway was restored to operational status in 15 hours. This timeline is not an approximation or a propaganda claim designed to boost morale. It is documented precisely in official Naval Construction Battalion action reports filed after the battle. While we lack diary entries or personal accounts from Japanese defenders who might have witnessed this achievement, since most Japanese forces on Tarawa died in the battle's final desperate banzai charge, the strategic implications were immediately apparent to Japanese high command personnel analyzing the battle's outcome. Intelligence assessments produced by Japanese staff officers and captured later in the war show calculations indicating that American forces could now establish air superiority over any captured territory within a matter of days rather than the weeks or months that pre-war Japanese planning had assumed would be required. The Marshall Islands operations conducted in early 1944 further reinforced this new strategic reality for Japanese planners. At Kwajalein Atoll, the 121st Naval Construction Battalion began transforming captured Japanese facilities into a major American aviation base, while combat operations were still ongoing on other parts of the atoll. More significantly, at Eniwetok Atoll, the 110th Naval Construction Battalion converted the damaged Japanese runway infrastructure into a 6,800-foot bomber strip capable of supporting B-24 Liberator heavy bomber operations against the major Japanese naval base at Truk. The speed at which American forces could convert captured enemy facilities into operational bases supporting their own operations represented a capability that Japanese military doctrine simply had no framework for understanding or countering effectively. The Japanese intelligence failure regarding American industrial and construction capabilities is extensively documented in translated documents held in various archives, including the National Institute for Defense Studies in Japan. Pre-war Japanese intelligence assessments had calculated that American merchant shipping construction would total approximately 5 million tons during 1943. The actual production figure was 19.2 million tons, representing an underestimate of nearly 400%. The magnitude of this intelligence failure extended across multiple domains. Japanese intelligence services had estimated that the United States Navy would have approximately 13,070 commissioned officers and 296,000 enlisted personnel by December 1943. The actual strength of the U.S. Navy at that date was 219,279 commissioned officers, 120,472 officer candidates undergoing training, and 2,034,343 enlisted personnel, a total force more than 7 times larger than Japanese intelligence had predicted. These massive intelligence failures in estimating American industrial production and personnel mobilization had direct operational consequences, but perhaps nowhere was the intelligence failure more immediately consequential in tactical and operational terms than in the area of construction capabilities. Japanese military doctrine, as preserved in captured training manuals and operational planning documents, allocated timeframes measured in months for major airfield construction projects. The Japanese military establishment simply had no conceptual framework for understanding mechanized construction at industrial scale and speed. Their own construction units operated with predominantly manual methods and basic tools. When the 17th Setsusei Tai construction unit was captured in the Solomon Islands and its personnel interrogated, American intelligence officers documented that this unit's equipment inventory consisted of 900 shovels, 90 hoes, and a limited number of manual rollers. They possessed virtually no mechanized equipment. Japanese construction personnel could not conceive that American aviation engineer battalions would routinely deploy with over 140 vehicles and more than 200 pieces of heavy construction equipment per battalion. This equipment gap translated directly into a capability gap of almost unimaginable proportions in terms of construction speed and capacity. The campaign for the Mariana Islands during the summer of 1944 brought the construction capability disparity into sharp strategic focus because these islands would provide bases from which B-29 Superfortress bombers could strike the Japanese home islands directly. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the Japanese 43rd Division defending the island of Saipan. He would witness American construction capabilities that defied everything in Japanese military experience and doctrine. Saipan's Aslito Airfield fell to advancing American forces on June 18th in 1944, a mere 3 days after the initial amphibious landings. Within 4 additional days, multiple construction units, including elements of the 3rd Battalion 20th Marines, along with the 121st and 18th Naval Construction Battalions, had restored the facility to operational status capable of supporting P-47 Thunderbolt fighter operations. By July, while desperate fighting still continued in the mountainous terrain of northern Saipan and Japanese forces launched repeated counterattacks, American construction personnel were already expanding the airfield to handle B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers. The first B-29, an aircraft named Joltin Josie from the 73rd Bombardment Wing, touched down on Saipan on October 12 in 1944. General Saito did not live to record his thoughts in any memoir or diary. He committed ritual suicide on July 7th in 1944 as American forces overwhelmed the last Japanese defensive positions. However, his final orders to his remaining troops, which were preserved and later translated by American intelligence services, reveal his understanding of what the rapid American airfield construction signified. His orders acknowledged that the barbaric attack of the enemy was continuing and that a final American assault was expected. He declared his intention to defend the emperor's domain unto death and stated he would never suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. Saito understood that Saipan's airfields would place Tokyo within range of American heavy bombers. What he could not have fully grasped in his final hours was the sheer scale of construction effort that would follow once American forces secured the island completely. The transformation of Saipan into a major forward base for B-29 bomber operations required moving literally millions of tons of coral and earth to create the necessary runway surfaces and supporting infrastructure. Seabees units operated their Caterpillar D7 and D8 bulldozers on 20-hour shifts, with only 4 hours per day reserved for essential maintenance. The D8 bulldozer, with its 148 horsepower diesel engine and hydraulic controls, could accomplish work equivalent to hundreds of manual laborers. Japanese forces had nothing remotely comparable in their equipment inventory. When interrogations of captured personnel from the 17th Setsusei Tai construction unit were conducted, the complete equipment inventory of this Japanese construction unit was revealed to consist of 5 trucks, 1 steam-powered roller, and predominantly hand tools. Japanese commanders on Saipan had calculated that properly fortifying their defensive positions would require months of construction effort. American Seabees units built multiple fully operational airfields supporting heavy bomber operations in a matter of weeks while combat operations continued. Even more shocking to Japanese military sensibilities and doctrine was the American ability to conduct construction operations while under fire. Japanese military thought placed enormous emphasis on Yamato Damashi, the Japanese warrior spirit, as the decisive factor in combat over material considerations. However, at Saipan and other battlefields across the Pacific, Japanese forces witnessed combat engineers who were simultaneously warriors and builders. The 121st Naval Construction Battalion had originally been attached to the United States Marine Corps, and its personnel were trained to fight as infantry while simultaneously possessing the technical expertise to operate heavy construction equipment. This dual capability, combining combat effectiveness with advanced technical skills, represented something entirely outside Japanese military experience and organizational culture. Japanese military units were typically either combat formations or support formations, but rarely both simultaneously with the same level of effectiveness in both roles. If the American construction achievement at Saipan shocked Japanese commanders who witnessed it, what subsequently occurred on the neighboring island of Tinian completely defied comprehension. The construction project undertaken on Tinian remains one of the largest and fastest military engineering accomplishments in human history. Between July 1944, when American forces secured the island, and May 1945, the 6th Naval Construction Brigade, comprising approximately 15,000 Seabees personnel, transformed Tinian into the world's largest operational bomber base complex. The statistics involved, which are verified through detailed Naval Construction Battalion records preserved in various archives, remain staggering even when viewed from the perspective of modern construction capabilities. 6 separate runways, each 8,500 feet in length, were carved from jungle terrain and coral bedrock. Northfield alone contained 4 parallel runways, each fully capable of launching B-29 Superfortress bombers on the 3,000-mile round-trip mission to Japan and back. Westfield added 2 additional runways of similar capability. The total amount of coral material that had to be extracted, crushed, graded, and compacted for these runways was equivalent to the volume of material in Hoover Dam multiplied by 3. Japanese forces defending Tinian under the command of Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata numbered approximately 9,000 troops. Most died during the battle for the island, and few left any detailed records of their observations. However, the speed and scale of American construction was evident even during active combat operations, and this can be inferred from prisoner interrogations conducted by the Office of Naval Intelligence after organized resistance ceased. While these interrogations naturally focused primarily on gathering tactical military intelligence rather than construction observations, several Japanese prisoners independently mentioned their profound amazement at American construction equipment and capabilities. One captured member of a Japanese naval construction unit stated in an interrogation, recorded in translation, that Japanese forces simply could not compete with United States Navy construction methods that employed bulldozers and power shovels versus Japanese methods that relied on shovels and manual labor performed by human workers. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who commanded Japanese garrison forces on the island of Iwo Jima, was perhaps the single Japanese officer best positioned by background and experience to understand American industrial capabilities. He had previously served as a military attaché assigned to Washington between 1928 and 1930, spending 2 years in the United States capital and traveling extensively throughout the United States observing American industrial facilities and military installations. His letters written home to his family during his time in America, which were later published in Japan under the title Picture Letters from the Commander-in-Chief, provide some of the very few surviving Japanese perspectives written by someone with direct observation of American industrial capacity. On February 19th in 1945, when United States Marine divisions stormed ashore at Iwo Jima in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, Kuribayashi commanded approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders. He had spent many months preparing elaborate defensive positions, transforming the small volcanic island into an underground fortress. Japanese construction troops under his command had excavated 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, built underground command posts and ammunition storage facilities, and constructed concealed artillery positions. This network of fortifications represented one of the most extensive Japanese construction projects of the entire war, accomplished over many months using predominantly manual labor. The American response to capturing Iwo Jima demonstrated a fundamentally different philosophy of military construction that prioritized speed and mechanical power over concealment and manual effort. The 31st and 133rd Naval Construction Battalions landed with the initial assault waves, coming ashore under intense enemy fire. The 133rd Naval Construction Battalion, which was attached to the 4th Marine Division, would suffer the highest casualty rate of any construction battalion in the entire war. Out of approximately 1,100 men in the battalion, 40 were killed in action, 156 were wounded, and 48 had to be evacuated for serious illness. Despite these severe casualties and the continuation of combat operations all around them, construction proceeded at a pace that would have seemed impossible to Japanese military engineers. Within days of the initial landing, construction personnel were already beginning repair work on damaged Japanese airfield facilities. By February 26th, just 1 week after the initial assault landing, the first American aircraft successfully landed on the partially repaired airfield. This was an OY-1 observation aircraft being used for artillery spotting missions. By March 4th, while intense fighting still raged across much of the island and Japanese defenders still controlled significant portions of the terrain, an even more significant event occurred. A B-29 Superfortress bomber named Dynamite from the 9th Bombardment Group made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima's repaired airfield. This aircraft had been damaged during a bombing mission over Tokyo and lacked sufficient fuel to return to its home base in the Mariana Islands. The rapidly repaired airfield on Iwo Jima, still technically in a combat zone, saved both the aircraft and its crew. Kuribayashi did not survive the battle to record his final thoughts on American construction capabilities in any memoir or diary. He died during the final Japanese assault on March 26 in 1945, either killed in combat or by his own hand according to varying accounts. However, his pre-invasion assessment of the strategic situation, which was preserved in Japanese military archives and subsequently translated, explicitly acknowledged American material superiority. He wrote that the enemy's offensive power and equipment were superior and that it was extremely difficult for Japanese forces to match them. What he could not have anticipated, based on his pre-war observation of American capabilities, was the extraordinary speed at which construction could proceed even under combat conditions. One specific incident that has been documented illustrates the construction capability gap between American and Japanese forces particularly well. Japanese military engineers on Iwo Jima had spent approximately 2 years attempting to construct a road to the summit of Mount Suribachi, the volcanic peak that dominates the southern portion of the island. Within 2 weeks of American forces capturing and securing the mountain, Seabees units had bulldozed a functional road all the way to the summit. This account, which has been recounted by Marine Corps historians studying the battle, allegedly caused a captured Japanese officer to weep when he learned of it, though the specific identity of this individual cannot be verified in available historical records. By the time the battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26 in 1945, the strategic value of the island's rapid airfield development had already become apparent. Over the course of the war's remaining months, more than 2,400 B-29 Superfortress bombers would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima's airfields, saving the lives of approximately 27,000 American airmen who would have otherwise been forced to ditch in the ocean. The airfields that made these life-saving landings possible were constructed and continuously maintained while under constant enemy fire from Japanese defenders still holding portions of the island, something Japanese military doctrine had never contemplated as feasible. The battle for Okinawa, beginning on April 1 in 1945, would provide the final major opportunity for Japanese forces to observe American construction capabilities in action. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who served as senior operations officer for the Japanese 32nd Army defending Okinawa, was uniquely positioned to witness and later document these capabilities. Unlike the vast majority of senior Japanese officers who died during the war, Yahara survived and subsequently wrote detailed memoirs titled The Battle for Okinawa, providing one of the very few comprehensive Japanese command-level perspectives on American operations. Yahara had previously served as an exchange officer in the United States from 1933 to 1935, studying at Fort Moultrie and traveling extensively to observe American military installations and training. His pre-war understanding of American military capabilities was more sophisticated and nuanced than most Japanese officers possessed. Even so, what he witnessed during the battle for Okinawa exceeded his expectations based on his earlier observations. The scale and speed of American construction operations at Okinawa remain remarkable even by modern standards. Within hours of the initial landing on April 1 in 1945, American forces had captured both Kadena and Yontan airfields, two strategically important prizes that Japanese forces had inexplicably left largely undefended in their defensive planning. By April 3rd, Seabees personnel from the 58th Naval Construction Battalion, along with the 1901 Aviation Engineer Battalion, were actively repairing and extending both captured airfields. Within 1 week of the initial landing, American fighter aircraft were operating from both facilities, providing close air support to ground forces engaged in heavy combat. The ultimate scale of construction operations planned and partially executed at Okinawa was unprecedented in Pacific War operations. Eventually, 95,000 Army and Navy construction personnel would be working on Okinawa simultaneously. American plans called for constructing facilities capable of accommodating 4,000 aircraft, essentially building the infrastructure necessary to support the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The 8th, 10th, 70th and 11th Naval Construction Brigades would ultimately build not merely airfields, but entire port facilities, ammunition storage dumps, hospital complexes, and massive supply depots, essentially constructing from scratch a complete military city while battle operations continued. Yahara's published memoir describes his growing awareness of American construction superiority. Though characteristically for a tactical operations officer, he focuses more extensively on tactical and strategic military matters than on engineering details. He specifically notes that American forces could establish fully operational base facilities faster than Japanese forces could organize and mount effective counterattacks against them. His detailed account of the failed Japanese counteroffensive launched on April 19th reveals the fundamental futility of attacking American positions that were being continuously reinforced and supplied through rapidly constructed logistical facilities. What Yahara witnessed, but perhaps lacked the technical vocabulary to fully articulate, was a fundamental philosophical difference in how American and Japanese forces approached military operations. Japanese military thought, heavily influenced by centuries of samurai tradition, emphasized spiritual factors and warrior ethos as the decisive elements in warfare. American military practice, by contrast, emphasized the systematic integration of industrial capability with combat power. Seabees represented combat engineers who carried rifles and operated bulldozers with equal competence. Their organizational structure brought civilian construction expertise and industrial methods directly into military operations. The Japanese military had no equivalent force structure. Their construction units consisted either of military engineers with limited equipment or conscripted civilian laborers with no combat training or capability. The full extent of Japanese intelligence failure regarding American construction capabilities only became truly clear after Japan's surrender. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted from 1945 through 1946, included extensive interrogations of Japanese military and civilian officials who had survived the war. These systematic interrogations, combined with captured planning documents subsequently translated by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, revealed how fundamentally Japanese planners had misunderstood American industrial and construction capabilities at every level. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had served as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet and later commanded the Second Air Fleet, admitted during post-war interrogations that Japanese naval planning had never seriously contemplated the speed at which American forces could construct forward bases. Japanese pre-war strategic doctrine had assumed that capturing an island meant gaining a defensive position that could be held for months while reinforcements and supplies were accumulated. The American capability to transform captured islands into offensive bases within days or weeks completely invalidated this entire strategic framework. The numerical data documents this intelligence failure with stark clarity. Japanese planning staffs had estimated that constructing a 6,000-foot runway capable of handling heavy bomber operations would require between 3,000 and 5,000 manual laborers working continuously for 3 to 6 months. American Seabee units routinely accomplished equivalent construction with 1,100 men in 20 days or less. This represented a 5 to 6-fold efficiency advantage, and when combined with the American ability to deploy multiple construction battalions simultaneously to different locations, it meant American construction proceeded at speeds Japanese planners had never imagined physically possible. The equipment disparity was equally dramatic and consequential. A single Caterpillar D8 bulldozer could move more cubic yards of earth in 1 hour than 300 manual laborers could move in a full working day. By 1944, American forces deployed throughout the Pacific Theater possessed hundreds of these machines operating continuously. The Japanese military had so few bulldozers in their entire inventory that captured American construction equipment was valued and prioritized above almost any other category of war materiel. The construction capability gap ultimately reflected much deeper industrial and organizational differences between the two nations at war. Japanese military construction throughout the war remained fundamentally rooted in traditional methods adapted from civilian construction practices. The predominant use of manual labor equipped with picks, shovels, and human-powered transport reflected both chronic equipment shortages and deeply embedded military cultural values. Japanese military doctrine placed enormous emphasis on spiritual strength and physical endurance as character-building virtues. Manual labor was regarded not merely as necessary due to equipment limitations, but as spiritually meaningful and character-building activity in its own right. American construction philosophy, by stark contrast, represented the complete industrialization of military engineering operations. The Seabees were recruited directly from the civilian construction industry with years of professional experience already. They brought industrial methods, time and motion efficiency studies, preventive maintenance schedules, and standardized operating procedures, all completely standard in American civilian construction practice, directly into military engineering operations. The extensive use of prefabrication and standardization that characterized American military construction was essentially foreign to Japanese construction practice. Marston matting for temporary runways, Quonset huts for rapidly erected structures, and standardized fuel storage tanks could all be mass-produced in American factories and shipped as complete integrated systems requiring only assembly at the destination. Japanese construction forces relied predominantly on local materials and custom construction methods unique to each individual project. This fundamental difference meant American forces could build both faster and with greater consistency across widely dispersed geographic locations throughout the Pacific Theater. The psychological impact on Japanese forces of witnessing American construction capabilities can be partially traced through the limited available documentary sources, including prisoner interrogation reports, captured personal letters, though most were heavily censored, and post-war testimony from survivors. While we lack the detailed, intimate personal accounts that would provide deeper emotional perspectives, the broad historical pattern is nonetheless clear. Japanese forces progressed through stages from initial confidence through confusion and growing awareness to eventual despair. The initial confidence is extensively documented in Japanese military doctrine and early war planning. Japanese military thought, deeply rooted in the cultural concept of Yamato Damashi or Japanese spirit, held that spiritual strength and warrior dedication could overcome material disadvantages in warfare. The dramatic success at Pearl Harbor and the rapid early conquests throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific during the first 6 months of war had seemed to validate this fundamental belief. Japanese military forces had defeated Western colonial powers across vast territories, despite often possessing inferior equipment, succeeding through superior fighting spirit, tactical skill, and operational audacity. The first sustained encounters with American construction capabilities at Guadalcanal, particularly the rapid American completion and continuous operation of Henderson Field despite repeated Japanese efforts to destroy it through aerial bombardment and naval gunfire, demonstrated something that transcended mere material superiority. It revealed organizational and industrial capabilities that Japanese forces simply could not match regardless of how fierce their fighting spirit might be. By 1943, prisoner interrogation reports reveal growing awareness among captured Japanese personnel of American technological and industrial superiority. Captured members of Japanese construction units consistently expressed professional amazement at American construction equipment and capabilities during interrogations. The strategic implications of American construction superiority became increasingly apparent and undeniable to Japanese field commanders as the war progressed. Every airfield captured by American forces became fully operational within days rather than months. Every island secured became an integrated base complex capable of supporting offensive operations against the next objective. The carefully planned defensive perimeter strategy that was supposed to exhaust American offensive momentum through lengthy sieges at each fortified position was being systematically bypassed through rapid base construction enabling the island-hopping campaign strategy. By 1944, the psychological impact had penetrated to the highest levels of Japanese strategic command. The loss of Saipan, which placed the Japanese home islands within effective B-29 heavy bomber range, directly caused the fall of Prime Minister Tojo's government. Japanese military and political leaders understood that American construction capabilities meant every lost island immediately became an offensive platform for attacking Japan itself. The construction of massive B-29 bomber base complexes on Tinian and Saipan proceeded faster than Japanese forces could develop any effective countermeasures or responses. The final psychological phase, which might be characterized as strategic despair, is evident in Japanese late-war defensive strategies and operational planning. The decision not to defend landing beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but instead to fight from prepared inland defensive positions, reflected an evolved understanding that American forces would inevitably establish beachheads and construct supporting facilities regardless of the intensity of initial resistance. Japanese defensive emphasis shifted from attempting to prevent American landings to inflicting maximum possible casualties, desperately hoping to make the American advance so costly in lives that political pressure might force negotiated peace rather than continuing to demand unconditional surrender. The strategic impact of American construction capabilities, particularly as embodied in the Seabees battalions, fundamentally altered the Pacific War's entire strategic trajectory. This represented far more than simply building military bases faster than Japanese forces anticipated. It constituted a revolution in military strategy enabled by construction technology married to industrial organizational methods. The island-hopping campaign strategy, which systematically bypassed heavily fortified Japanese strongholds to seize less defended islands suitable for rapid base construction, was only operationally feasible because of American rapid construction capabilities. Admiral Chester Nimitz's strategic decision to bypass Rabaul, the major Japanese base complex in the Southwest Pacific, was explicitly predicated on the demonstrated American ability to quickly construct airfields on surrounding islands that could neutralize Rabaul through sustained air power without requiring its physical capture. The timeline compression achieved through American construction capabilities was absolutely dramatic. Pre-war Japanese strategic planning had confidently assumed that any sustained American offensive across the Pacific would inevitably require many years of deliberate methodical advance, with long operational pauses at each stage, to laboriously construct the necessary supporting base infrastructure. Instead, American forces advanced from Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands to Okinawa in the Ryukyus, a distance exceeding 3,000 miles, in less than 3 years of sustained operations. Each island captured was rapidly transformed into an integrated base complex, supporting and enabling the next offensive operation in the sequence. Meanwhile, a profound disconnect existed between what Japanese military forces were witnessing and experiencing in the field and what Japanese civilians were being told at home. Japanese wartime censorship, extensive even measured against other nations' wartime information control, systematically suppressed accurate information about American construction and broader industrial capabilities. Personal letters written home by Japanese soldiers serving overseas were subject to rigorous censorship review. Any references to American equipment superiority, construction speed, or overwhelming material advantages were systematically deleted or caused entire letters to be withheld. The few surviving uncensored letters, mostly those that never successfully reached Japan due to transportation disruptions, reveal soldiers expressing amazement and sometimes despair at American capabilities, but these authentic perspectives never reach the Japanese homefront population. Japanese propaganda consistently portrayed Americans as spiritually weak, dependent on material comforts, and fundamentally unable to match Japanese warrior spirit and dedication. Radio Tokyo broadcasts, which were systematically monitored and translated by American signals intelligence, consistently emphasized supposed Japanese spiritual superiority over American materialism. The operational reality that American forces demonstrated both overwhelming material superiority and the capability to endure extraordinarily harsh combat conditions was systematically hidden from Japanese civilian population. Even factual military reporting that was publicly released was deliberately distorted to conceal unwelcome truths. The fall of Saipan was presented to the Japanese public as a heroic defensive battle against numerically overwhelming enemy forces, with no mention whatsoever that American forces had established operational B-29 heavy bomber bases on the island, while combat was still ongoing elsewhere on Saipan. The rapid American advance through the Philippine Islands during 1944 and early 1945 was attributed entirely to overwhelming numerical superiority rather than acknowledging the systematic American ability to establish supporting base infrastructure at unprecedented speed. This fundamental information gap between military reality and civilian understanding had significant strategic consequences. Japanese civilian morale remained relatively stable and high until B-29 bombing raids against Japanese cities began in earnest during late 1944. Ordinary Japanese civilians could not understand how American heavy bombers could suddenly reach Japan when the defensive perimeter was supposedly still largely intact and holding. They had no knowledge that American construction battalions had built massive integrated airbase complexes on captured Pacific islands in mere months, rather than the years Japanese doctrine assumed would be required. The final comprehensive accounting of American construction achievement in the Pacific theater provides essential context for understanding the scale of Japanese strategic defeat. By the war's conclusion, naval construction battalions and Army engineer units had systematically transformed the vast Pacific theater into an integrated network of American bases that rendered Japan's strategic position utterly hopeless. Total Seabees strength during World War II reached 325,000 personnel, with approximately 80% serving in the Pacific theater. These men constructed 111 major airstrips and 441 piers and docks. They built ammunition storage magazines for 2,558 separate facilities and warehouses, covering an area equivalent to 700 square city blocks. They constructed housing facilities for 1.5 million military personnel and fuel storage capacity for 100 million gallons. They built over 300 distinct base complexes on as many separate islands across the Pacific. The construction equipment deployed to achieve these results was equally staggering in scale. Over 50,000 bulldozers were manufactured in American factories during the war years, with thousands deployed specifically to Pacific theater operations. The Caterpillar D7, which became the workhorse of Pacific construction operations, weighed 15,000 pounds and could generate 25,000 pounds of drawbar pulling force. Japanese military forces had nothing remotely comparable in their equipment inventory throughout the entire war. The innovation of Marston matting, also called pierced steel planking, revolutionized temporary airfield construction methodology. Each individual mat section was 10 feet long by 15 inches wide, weighed 66 pounds, and incorporated 87 drainage holes in its design. By 1943, American factories had manufactured sufficient Marston matting to construct 240 complete runways, each measuring 150 feet wide by 5,000 feet long. Total wartime production of Marston matting reached 2 million tons, equivalent to the total steel required for 600 Liberty cargo ships. Human efficiency statistics were perhaps most revealing of the capability gap. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Seabees personnel maintained and continuously repaired the runway through 140 separate Japanese air raids and 2 major naval bombardments. During the massive October 13th to 14th battleship bombardment that created 53 separate craters in the runway surface, construction crews filled every crater and restored the runway to operational status by dawn. This demonstrated repair speed, literally faster than the enemy could inflict damage, represented capability completely outside Japanese military experience and doctrinal understanding. Construction speed records were consistently exceeded throughout the Pacific campaign. The 20-day construction timeline for the initial Espiritu Santo airstrip in July 1942 set an early benchmark that seemed remarkable at the time. By 1943, the 47th Naval Construction Battalion completed a 3,300-foot operational runway on Vangunu Island in the Solomon Chain in just 9 days. The 15-hour complete rehabilitation of Tarawa's battle-damaged airfield in November 1943 demonstrated that captured Japanese facilities could be restored to operational status almost immediately after combat ceased. The island of Tinian alone perfectly demonstrates the scale of American construction capability. In less than 1 year, 15,000 Seabee personnel constructed the world's largest airbase complex from essentially nothing. Northfield's 4 parallel 8,500-foot runways could launch 100 B-29 Superfortress bombers per day on missions to Japan. This single-base complex, constructed in months rather than years, could deliver more explosive tonnage to Japan than the entire remaining Japanese military could deploy in defensive operations. The planned transformation of Okinawa was even more ambitious in scope. Construction plans called for facilities capable of supporting 4,000 aircraft, exceeding Japan's entire remaining operational air force. Port facilities designed to support the massive invasion fleet, ammunition storage dumps for the anticipated casualties during the planned invasion of Japan, hospital complexes and supply depots adequate for millions of troops were all actively under construction when Japan finally surrendered. While most senior Japanese officers who directly witnessed American construction capabilities did not survive the war, the convergence of multiple types of historical evidence creates a compelling comprehensive picture of how Japanese forces experienced and gradually came to understand these capabilities that so exceeded their expectations. American construction records provide precise timelines, statistics, and technical details. Japanese strategic decisions reveal their evolving awareness of construction's decisive importance. The limited surviving Japanese testimonies offer important glimpses of professional military amazement mixed with strategic despair. Colonel Hiramichi Yahara's survival and subsequent detailed memoir make his testimony particularly valuable as historical evidence. His published account of the Okinawa battle explicitly describes American construction operations as proceeding with mechanical precision and notes that American engineer surveying teams often operated more than half a mile in front of active combat infantry positions, marking future construction sites while still under potential enemy fire. He directly observed Seabees surveying teams operating in contested no-man's land for days ahead of Marine infantry units, calmly marking locations for future construction while combat raged nearby. Yahara's strategic assessment, written after the war with the benefit of reflection, explicitly acknowledged that American construction capabilities had rendered the entire Japanese defensive strategy fundamentally untenable. He wrote that the enemy's overwhelming material superiority, particularly in engineering and construction capabilities, meant that any defensive position Japanese forces evacuated would very quickly become a fully developed base supporting further enemy advances. This professional military recognition came far too late to influence Japanese wartime strategy, but it demonstrates that at least some thoughtful Japanese officers came to understand the implications, even if that understanding came only in defeat. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, who served as senior staff officer for Admiral Onishi, the creator of the Kamikaze Special Attack Program, survived the war and provided extensive testimony about Japanese naval perspectives on American capabilities during interrogations and later interviews. While his primary focus naturally centered on air operations and kamikaze tactics, he explicitly noted that American ability to rapidly establish operational air bases on every captured island had rendered traditional naval strategy completely obsolete. Every island that fell immediately projected American air power further westward, systematically compressing the defensive perimeter faster than Japanese forces could effectively adjust their dispositions or strategy. Perhaps the most detailed Japanese professional perspective on American construction capabilities comes not from combat officers, but from Japanese military engineers who worked on fortification projects. Post-war interrogations of surviving personnel from Japanese construction units reveal their profound professional amazement at American construction methods and equipment. One engineer from the 17th Setsusei Tai Unit, whose individual name is not recorded in available interrogation documents, reportedly stated during questioning that observing American construction operations in action was like witnessing the future itself. watching machines accomplish in mere hours what his own unit would require weeks to complete using manual labor methods. More compelling than any individual testimony, however, are the strategic decisions themselves that reveal Japanese command-level understanding of American construction capabilities. The deliberate decision not to defend landing beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but instead to establish defensive positions inland, reflected evolved understanding that American forces would inevitably establish secure beachheads and construct supporting facilities regardless of how fierce initial resistance might be. The strategic shift from attempting to hold territory to focusing solely on inflicting maximum casualties demonstrated recognition that American construction capabilities made any territorial defense ultimately futile. The kamikaze special attack program itself can be partially understood as a desperate response to American construction superiority. Traditional naval aviation required elaborate base infrastructure, extensive maintenance facilities, and highly trained ground support crews. As American construction battalions systematically built forward bases while simultaneously destroying Japanese facilities through bombing, the material foundation for conventional Japanese air operations steadily eroded. Kamikaze attacks, requiring only sufficient fuel for a one-way mission and minimal maintenance support, represented an attempt to continue meaningful air operations despite the progressive loss of base infrastructure. Intelligence planning documents captured after Japan's surrender revealed Japanese attempts to develop various countermeasures specifically targeting American construction capabilities. Plans existed for specialized infiltration units tasked with sabotaging construction equipment and assassinating equipment operators. Chemical weapons were seriously considered for contaminating construction sites to render them unusable. None of these desperate plans achieved effective implementation, reflecting both Japan's weakened position and robust American security measures protecting construction operations. The final Japanese Homeland Defense Plan, developed during 1945, demonstrated complete awareness of American construction capabilities and their implications. Planning assumptions explicitly accepted that any American amphibious landing on the home islands would very quickly establish massive integrated base complexes, regardless of defensive resistance intensity. Japanese strategy had shifted entirely from any hope of preventing base construction to forcing American forces to build those inevitable bases over such massive numbers of Japanese dead that political pressure in America might somehow force negotiated peace rather than continuing the drive toward unconditional surrender. By late 1944, senior Japanese military and political leadership had begun to fully comprehend the strategic implications of American construction capabilities, though this belated recognition came far too late to alter the war's inevitable trajectory. The fall of Prime Minister Tojo's government following the loss of Saipan reflected political acknowledgement that American B-29 bases would soon subject the home islands to sustained devastating strategic bombardment that Japan had no effective means to prevent or counter. Japanese military response to specific threats revealed their understanding. The desperate all-out defense of Iwo Jima, where Japanese forces inflicted the highest casualty rates on American forces of any Pacific battle, was explicitly motivated by knowledge that the island's airfields would provide fighter escort capability for B-29s attacking Japan, dramatically increasing bombing effectiveness. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's decision to abandon traditional Japanese banzai charge tactics in favor of a deliberate defensive campaign of attrition reflected his understanding that the airfields would inevitably be built and become operational regardless of Japanese actions. The only variable under any Japanese control was the cost in American lives. Similarly, the defensive strategy implemented at Okinawa explicitly aimed to hold out as long as humanly possible, while kamikaze attacks struck American naval forces offshore, but acknowledged that the island would inevitably become a massive American base complex. Colonel Yahara's carefully planned defense explicitly accepted that American forces would successfully establish airfields and port facilities. Japanese defensive goals focused entirely on making construction as costly as possible in American casualties rather than actually preventing it. This progression from initial surprise through gradual recognition to strategic adaptation and ultimately acceptance of defeat demonstrates that Japanese forces did ultimately understand and attempt to respond to American construction capabilities, even though detailed personal documentation of their observations largely failed to survive. The strategic decisions themselves function as a form of historical testimony, revealing through command actions what written personal records do not preserve. The complete story of Japanese encounters with American Naval Construction Battalion capabilities ultimately emerges more through statistics, strategic impacts, and adaptation patterns than through personal testimonies and emotional accounts. The systematic destruction of Japanese military records and the limited survival of personal writings means we necessarily lack the intimate individual perspectives that would fully illuminate how Japanese soldiers and officers emotionally experienced the shock of American construction superiority. Yet the historical evidence that does survive, including detailed construction statistics, observable strategic decisions, limited personal testimonies, and comprehensive post-war analyses, collectively tell a compelling story of gradual painful recognition and its strategic impact. Japanese military forces throughout the Pacific War witnessed something genuinely unprecedented in military history: the complete industrialization of military construction, enabling strategic advances at speeds that pre-war planning across all nations had never seriously contemplated as achievable. The 20-day construction of the Espiritu Santo airstrip, the 15-hour rehabilitation of Tarawa's damaged airfield, the massive B-29 base complexes built on Tinian while combat raged on neighboring islands. These remarkable achievements represented far more than impressive engineering accomplishments. They fundamentally embodied an industrial and organizational superiority that rendered Japanese strategic defeat inevitable once American forces secured their initial foothold in the Pacific theater and began their systematic advance. For Japanese military professionals who possessed sufficient technical knowledge to understand the implications, witnessing American construction capabilities in action must have been profoundly demoralizing at the deepest level. They were fighting not merely against American military forces, but against the full weight of American industrial civilization projected across thousands of miles of ocean through military engineering. Every Japanese defensive position laboriously constructed over months using predominantly manual labor could be matched or exceeded by American construction engineers in days or at most weeks. The strategic impact was absolutely undeniable. Rapid base construction enabled the island-hopping campaign strategy that systematically bypassed Japanese strongholds. It compressed the timeline of American offensive advance from the years Japanese planning had assumed to mere months of sustained operations. It brought the Japanese home islands within range of devastating strategic bombardment far earlier than Japanese strategic planners had believed possible. Most fundamentally, it demonstrated beyond any possibility of denial that the Pacific War represented not merely a contest between military forces, but between entire industrial systems and national economies. And in that broader contest, Japan simply could not effectively compete. The limited Japanese personal testimonies that survived consistently express amazement at American equipment capabilities and construction speed. Observable strategic decisions reveal progressive awareness of construction's decisive importance to campaign outcomes. The desperate late-war defensive strategies implemented at Iwo Jima and Okinawa implicitly acknowledged that American base construction would proceed regardless of defensive resistance. The Kamikaze Special Attack Program represented an asymmetric response to material and industrial superiority that could not be matched through conventional methods. This historical narrative concludes not with dramatic testimony about impossible American construction feats, but with strategic capitulation to industrial reality that could no longer be denied or resisted. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, transmitted on August 15 in 1945, spoke explicitly of a new and most cruel bomb referring to atomic weapons, but also acknowledged more broadly that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. This masterpiece of understatement encompassed numerous factors, But among them was surely awareness that American forces could project industrial power across the Pacific at scales and speeds that made any continued resistance completely futile, regardless of Japanese fighting spirit or tactical skill. The Seabee motto, Construimus batuimus, Latin for we build, we fight, represented something genuinely new in military affairs. These were combat engineers capable of building under direct fire at industrial speeds and scales. For Japanese military forces who witnessed this unprecedented capability firsthand, it must have felt like confronting the future itself, a future where spiritual strength and warrior dedication alone could not overcome bulldozers, prefabricated construction materials, and sophisticated industrial organization methods. The 6,000-foot airstrips constructed in 20 days were not merely impressive feats of military engineering, but powerful symbols of a fundamentally new form of warfare that Japanese military tradition and doctrine had not prepared them to understand or effectively counter. Ultimately, the historical story of Japanese encounters with American construction capabilities speaks more eloquently through actions than through words, through strategic adaptations and defensive adjustments and the final acceptance of defeat rather than through destroyed documents and unrecorded testimonies. These observable actions tell of a military force that gradually came to understand it faced not merely an enemy military, but an entire industrial system, and that against such a comprehensively superior system, traditional military virtues of courage and dedication alone could not achieve victory. The legacy of this encounter extends far beyond World War II's conclusion. The industrialization of military construction so dramatically demonstrated by Seabee operations in the Pacific became a permanent defining feature of modern warfare. The capability to rapidly establish forward bases, to project logistical support across vast distances, to build infrastructure faster than enemies can destroy it. These capabilities, first witnessed by Japanese forces throughout the Pacific, remain absolutely central to military strategy and operations in the present day. For historians studying this period, the limited surviving documentation of Japanese perspectives on American construction capabilities represents simultaneously a frustration and an important reminder. It frustrates because we lack the rich personal accounts that would bring greater emotional depth and individual human perspective to this story. It reminds us that history is frequently shaped by capabilities and systemic factors that contemporaries may not fully document precisely because they lack adequate conceptual frameworks to fully understand the significance of what they are witnessing. Japanese forces who watched Seabee battalions constructing airfields at seemingly impossible speeds were witnessing a genuine revolution in military affairs, but many may not have possessed the technical knowledge or strategic perspective to fully articulate what they were observing in its broader implications. The statistical evidence, however, communicates with absolute clarity across the intervening decades. The 111 major airstrips, the 441 constructed piers, the base facilities adequate for 1.5 million military personnel, these documented achievements fundamentally changed the Pacific War's strategic trajectory and ultimate outcome. For Japanese military forces who watched these bases rising from jungle and coral, who witnessed airfields becoming fully operational in days rather than the months their own doctrine specified, who observed the inexorable advance of American construction capability steadily across the Pacific, these numbers represented something far more significant than mere statistics. They represented the future of modern warfare arriving at speeds and scales their entire military tradition had never imagined remotely possible, and against which their courage and dedication, however genuine, ultimately proved insufficient to achieve victory.